Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our conversation, please send us your questions and let us know where you're joining from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Henry Weil share his firsthand account of the Holocaust with us today. Henry, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person today.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you to the entire audience for allowing me to join you today. I am honored and privileged to be able to do so. It is so important for us to continue to talk about the Holocaust and the horrors that so many of us experienced. Let me just say at the outset that there are two categories of Holocaust survivors. There are those who were interned in concentration camps, many of which were murdered, and others who survived. And then there's the other category, such as mine, which are the categories of the survivors who were able to escape the Holocaust at the very last minute in my case. I was able to escape with my mother and father at the 11th hour, days before the war in Europe broke out. And it is my privilege to be here today and to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Well, Henry, thank you again for joining us today. We have a lot for you to cover, so we'll go ahead and move into it, Henry. You were born in Vienna, Austria on September 22nd, 1935, almost 3 years before almost 3 years after Hitler came to power in neighboring Germany. Please tell us about your parents, Hugo and Marischka, and what you know of their life in Austria in the early 1930s.
Yes. We lived in Vienna, Austria, in what is known as the 9th District, which was a very nice part of the city. We were very comfortable living there. There's a photograph of my father and my mother. And as you can see, they're nicely dressed. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had a very, very nice life. We had an extended family. I had aunts and uncles there and cousins, and we were together very, very frequently, usually on weekends when we all got together for various activities. And it was a very, very nice life. We were very happy living in Vienna until March of 1938, when the Anschluss occurred. That is the occupation of Austria by the Nazis.
And Henry, before we move on to the Anschluss, a few more questions of you. Neither of your parents were from Vienna. How did they end up in Vienna, and how'd they meet?
Well, my mother was born in Budapest, Hungary. My father in Prague, in what was then Czechoslovakia. Their families moved them to Vienna early on, maybe in the early 20s. I don't know exactly what the reason was, but I assume that there were living conditions in those areas where they were living were not good for Jews. And they thought that they would have a much better life in Vienna, which they did. My father worked for his uncle in a store where they sold leather goods and jewelry. And there's a photograph of Philip Weils' store. Mm-hmm. That is the store where my father worked, and that is his uncle, Philip. And so it was a very nice life, as I said before. Thank you.
And you were born 10 years after your parents were married, and you were very close to your cousins who lived nearby. Tell us what you remember about, the time you had with your cousins and your extended family from that era.
Sure. My mother's sisters had two daughters, Mary and Ilse. They lived not too far from where we were in Vienna. And my mother's brother, Ernest, my uncle Ernie, had two children, Anne and Tom. And on weekends, often we were together playing either at my apartment house or in the park nearby or in their neighborhoods. And so we were very, very close and really enjoyed our lives in Vienna.
Was your family religiously observant?
Yeah, observant, yes. I mean, they were not what is known as ultra-Orthodox, but they believed very, very strongly in their religion, attended synagogues on a regular basis, yes.
And before we move on to continue the discussion about the Anschluss, tell us what you remember or you know from your parents about the neighborhood where you lived prior to the Anschluss.
It was, as I said, very nice neighborhood. This is a photograph of a park nearby. You can see my picture there, dressed very nicely. And the neighborhood was very, very nice. It was also interesting that a very famous psychoanalyst by the name of Sigmund Freud, who I'm sure you've heard of, lived about a block away. And as it were, my father would play cards with Sigmund Freud. And once my father told me years later that some of his friends who were, participating in those card games thought that Sigmund Freud was crazy. That's what they said. Now,
Well,
I don't attribute any truth to that. Excuse me.
Thank you, Henry. So before we move on, let me say that we have people watching and listening to you today from all over this country as well as from around the world. So we have viewers today watching from Minnesota, Indiana, Maine, Texas, and Maryland. And hello to our international viewers in South Africa, Australia, Canada, Argentina, and the Netherlands. So thanks to everybody who's tuning in to see you today, Henry.
Thank you very much.
In March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria, in which we know as the Anschluss, and you mentioned it a few moments ago. When German troops crossed the border into Austria on March 12th, they received enthusiastic support from most of the country's population. We have some film footage of Vienna from around the time of the Anschluss that we're going to show. We see Nazi flags hanging throughout the city. It looks celebratory. You can see that some of the crowd is enthusiastic. And here we see footage from a parade with soldiers marching through the streets. Although you were very young, Henry, just 2.5 at that time, tell us what you can about the Anschluss.
What I remember as a young child is this. First of all, let me just say that the Anschluss occurred it took place maybe within a day or two with no resistance whatsoever. The Austrians were very, very happy to have the German, the Third Reich coming in. And it was just amazing how quickly that went. It may have been in part due to the fact that Adolf Hitler himself was born in Austria. Mm-hmm. But what I do remember is being in my apartment one day, and when I heard drums beating and I heard soldiers marching, and I went over to the window and I looked out, and there were the German troops were marching directly in front of my apartment house. I thought it was kind of fun. I thought it was a parade. But my mother, on the other hand, was just absolutely hysterical. And that's when my parents, I believe, decided that things were not getting any better. They were only getting worse day by day. And it was time to make arrangements to try to get the necessary documentation to be able to escape the horrors which were to follow. And that's exactly what they did.
And of course, to talk a little bit about that, if you could, immediately following the Anschluss, anti-Semitic policies resulted in restrictions being imposed upon Jews, as well as public humiliation and anti-Semitic violence. What can you tell us about some of those restrictions and these threats that were occurring to daily life for Jews in Austria and Vienna at that time?
Life changed drastically from what it was before the Anschluss to where we were restricted. We could not go to the playgrounds. We were not allowed to go to the parks. As I understand it, that I didn't go to the movie theaters, but I do recall my parents telling me that was no longer permitted. So there were many, many restrictions, and things just got worse, it seems, day by day by day. And my parents felt that it was just absolutely essential to try to escape.
At that time, Henry, one of your cousins that you grew up with was a little older than you and took on an important task for the family. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I had a cousin, Mary, who was a few years older than I. She was the daughter of my Aunt Hilda and my Uncle Sam. They lived not too far. And because she had blonde hair and blue eyes, she was chosen by the family to go out at night and buy whatever groceries she could and bring them home for the extended family. And she was just absolutely petrified. She told me many years later, as a matter of fact, many years later when she arrived in America, she converted. And I said to her once, Mary, why did you do that? She said, I was just so petrified walking down the streets and having those Germans looking at me and staring at me. I just never wanted to go through that again. I never wanted to be Jewish again. By the way, my cousin Mary was sent by her parents to England to live out the war. Her younger sister Ilsa was part of what is known as the Kinder Transport, also sent to England. They were reunited with their parents once the war was over.
Henry, we have here a photograph that shows Jews being forced to scrub pavement in Vienna soon after the Anschluss. Tell us what really stands out for you in this photograph.
Well, as you can see, the people seem to be very happy and doing whatever destruction they could do. As I recall, my parents telling me that they were just horrible. And what's so sad is you see people, the bystanders, with smiles on their face, just delighted on what they're watching. It was just so shocking. And that's unfortunately true today when people see horrific things being done. They are innocent bystanders and they don't do anything or say anything. Very, very sad to see.
And a very powerful photo for the reasons you just described. Henry, we have a video question from a student, from Anna from Rockville, Maryland. Let's go ahead and hear from Anna.
You were so young when Hitler and the Nazi regime was rising to power in Eastern Europe. Because of your age, did you have any sense of the danger to your family as you were an observant Jewish family at the time? And did your parents try to protect you from the dangers that were Nazi Germany and how Jews were being treated and persecuted at the time?
Henry, Anna asks, because of your age, you were just 2.5 years old at the time, did you have any sense of the dangers to your family? And how did your parents try to protect you from the dangers that were around you?
My parents did protect me. I was too young to really appreciate the dangers and the horrors of what was going on all around me. And so my parents shielded me from all of that. And they continued to do so even after we came to America. And I really wasn't provided with any real significant information until I was a little older in middle school and high school, before my parents really started to talk to me about what had happened. So the answer is they did shield me. Thank you.
They did shield you, yeah. Henry, the Jewish community in Vienna recognized the dangers that they were facing, and many scrambled to leave and find safe haven. In the year and a half after the Anschluss, more than 100,000 people managed to flee Vienna. So many families were trying to emigrate at the same time that it prompted a global refugees crisis. The immigration process to the United States in the late 1930s was complicated, requiring individuals to acquire large amounts of paperwork. Among other things, visa applicants had to get affidavits. Will you explain to us what an affidavit was and tell us about your father's efforts to try to secure one for your family so that you could leave?
Sure. My father would go every day to the consulate, to the American consulate, to try to obtain the necessary documentation that was required to be able to leave Austria. One document in particular that was required was an affidavit of support. Now, there was a gentleman in Boston. We didn't know anybody that would provide us with such an affidavit, but there was a gentleman in Boston whose name is Mr. Rice. There's a photograph of the affidavit on the screen. Mr. Rice, who didn't know us, we did not know him, provided this affidavit of financial support for my family. You can see there about midway down, Mr. Rice was earning at that time $26 a week. Now, $26 a week by today's economy would be somewhat more, but still not a lot of money. And here's a man who, out of the goodness of his heart, provided such an affidavit. If it wasn't for Mr. Rice, I wouldn't be sitting here today talking with you. And what's interesting is that Mr. Rice, I don't know how this affidavit even came into being, because he didn't know us, as I said. I can only assume that maybe he provided such an affidavit for other families as well by sending blank affidavits to the American consulate and having them fill out the names. I just don't know, because it were very, very small quotas, and we were a group of lucky ones who were able to get those documents, including this affidavit of support.
And from this affidavit document, we can see that Mr. Rice was, as you said, he earned $26 a week. He was 27. He was married and had a 1-year-old child. And he lists the reason why your father wanted to come to the United States as, quote, the German government's attitude towards the Jewish people in Germany, end quote. He was also, Mr. Rice was also in the leather industry, and lists his occupation as that in New York. But tell us your thoughts about, what he wrote there about that the reason for your leaving.
Well, obviously, Mr. Rice is correct. I mean, the reason for our wanting to leave was the persecution of the Jewish people in Austria. And it's interesting, we didn't really, well, my mother had a brother, my Uncle Joe, who had come to America several years after the end of the First World War. He was already living in New York. That may have been the compelling reason for why my parents selected America as their first choice. And thank God I'm so happy that they did. I'm delighted. I'm very happy that they selected America. I'm happy, had a nice life here. But other than that, I just don't, I don't know what prompted them, because there's so many survivors here at the Holocaust Museum who tell me that they just got on a boat. They didn't know where they were going. Some of them wound up in Shanghai and South America. I met a gentleman in Aruba one day who was from Berlin. I mean, it was just, you did what you had to do to get
wherever
away.
you could get a place willing to take you. And your father was successful. He was able to get this affidavit and then get a visa to travel to the United States. But then there's a problem with the visa. Tell us about this.
Yeah, there was a hitch. My father, after weeks and months went by, gets the affidavit, and when he looks at the documents, it only has his name. It doesn't have my mother's name. Doesn't have my name. So my father goes back, gets in lines again, and goes through essentially the process from the beginning until he's able to convince whoever was handling these matters to include my mother's name and my name. They had originally told him, Hugo, you're the only name that is required. Your wife and your son will be able to travel with you. But my father, thank goodness, was very detail oriented, and he didn't accept that. So he finally got that. That caused further delay.
I think as your father described it to you, the way you described it to me, your father said it was a nightmare, the whole process, making those arrangements. So what can you tell us about what you remember or know of the length of time it took from when your father and mother decided to take action and you were finally able to get the affidavit and the visas?
I'm not exactly sure of when they put this process into motion, but I assume somehow I connect it with my having observed these German troops marching in front of our apartment building, and I don't know exactly when that was, whether it was closer to the Anschluss or closer to Kristallnacht, which is the night of the broken glass, which happened in November of 1930. I'm not exactly sure when the process started, but what I do know is it took not only days and weeks, but months, because from the beginning, we didn't leave Austria until very late August or the first week of September of 1939, which was just days before World War II started in Europe.
So I think altogether, the way you've described it, I think it took about 18 months, almost a year and a half. And so after a year and a half of trying to leave Vienna in August 1939, as you just said, your family, but before they were able to leave, you were forced out of your apartment. Tell us about that incident and how the family was able to find shelter. Here you were so close to trying to leave Vienna.
Sure. When my father finally was able to obtain the necessary documentation and the affidavit from Mr. Rice, we were told that we would be heading to Southampton, England, where there would be a ship waiting to bring us to America. We were put out of our apartment within the first few days of September, or the last couple of days of August. I'm not sure exactly, but we couldn't leave the city for whatever reason. I'm not sure. Fortunately, my father had a friend that he had made a number of years before, who was now actually a German soldier, and this friend offered to allow my mother, my father, and myself to stay with him and his family in his home for a few days before it was safe for us to leave the city. What an act of kindness that was. This is a man that took us in at great risk, not only to himself, but to his entire family, if he had been caught doing this.
And at
But
the time, he
ultimately,
was a
we
member
were
of the
able-
German army.
I'm sorry?
And at the time, he was a member of the German army doing that.
Yes, he was a member of the German army, but he was a friend of my father's, and he took pity on us.
And when you got through that and were able to finally leave, besides each other, what did your family take with you when you left Vienna?
Very little, essentially the clothes on our back, but there is an inventory document that's being shown on the screen. I think it shows my father was a big opera buff, and it shows my father's opera glasses. It shows my mother's iron, and I think some few dollars, maybe $10 or $20 in currency. But other than that, that was it. That was the inventory that was.
That was it,
provided.
all that you had with you. Well, what can you tell us about actually leaving Vienna now that you were able to do it with the affidavit and the visas, and you're on your way? How did you leave? What do you remember of it?
Once we were released to leave, we had to travel on our way to Southampton through Paris, France. When we arrived in Paris, we were met with air raids every night. We were there for almost a week. I don't remember the exact length of time, but it was close to a week. And we spent most of that time every night in an air raid shelter. One of the things that I do remember is my father had picked me up to run to the shelter. And on the way, he lost one of his shoes. Didn't stop to pick up his shoe, just kept running, and went with me and my mother to the air raid shelter. Many nights when we were headed to the air raid shelter was already full, filled to capacity, and we were not allowed to enter. So we had to ride in the metro all night, waiting until the air raids would stop. And this went on, as I say, for several days, close to approximately a week, which caused further delay. And that becomes very significant, and which I'll be telling you about in just a few minutes.
Okay, and before we move on, I'd like to remind our audience that if you have any questions for Henry, to please use our chat feature to get them to Henry. Henry, of course, at that time, as you're leaving Vienna and heading to Paris and on to eventually the United States, was at the time of the beginning of the World War II itself. World War II began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and the British and the French declared war on Germany on September 3rd. So your family's desperately trying to leave. You're now made it to Paris. You're experiencing bombings and going air raid shelters. Where did you go from Paris, and what do you know about that part of your journey?
Once we were able to leave Paris, as I said, we were headed to Southampton, England. Our first place where we first stopped was in Le Havre, France, which was on the Channel, on the English Channel. We crossed the English Channel, arrived in Southampton, and lo and behold, the ship that we had been told would be bringing us to America had already left port because of the long delays that my father encountered in obtaining the necessary documentation, and the further delay in being held up in Paris and the air raid shelters. The ship had already left. We had no idea what was going to happen with us. Fortunately for us, that ship that we were scheduled to depart on was sunk by German U-boats. Sunk by German U-boats.
So just by the fortune of delay, you missed
In the
that.
delay, our lives were saved on two different in two different aspects, leaving Austria and missing that ship. Fortunately, there was another ship that we were placed on, the Aquitania, and we were able to come to America on the Aquitania.
Henry, before we continue on with your journey on the Aquitania and coming to the United States, got a comment from a viewer who says, this is Pamela. Pamela writes, hello from Alberta, Canada. As a teacher, I try my best to educate classes on these horrific acts and how difficult it was for people who both had to stay and found a way to leave. Just a comment from one of our viewers to you, Henry. So here you are on the Aquitania. Fortunately, the ship is the one left after the U-boat got the one that you were supposed to have been on. But your dangers from U-boats were not over for you. Tell us about that, and then about your journey to New York itself.
That is an article that appeared in the New York Daily Mirror, and I believe the date is September the 17th, 1939. We arrived in New York Harbor the day before on September the 16th, 1939. And about midway down on the right is a photograph of three boys wearing life vests. That's me in the middle. And the other boys are the Weiner brothers from Germany. And what's so interesting is that we are required to wear those life vests for the entire journey. We had to sleep in those life vests because we were being chased by German U-boats, such as the U-boats that had torpedoed the ship that we were originally scheduled to depart on. And there's another photograph on that page of a ladder that was placed on the deck with a notification in case of a torpedo this way out, which we were told was if we were being struck by a torpedo, we were to ascend that ladder to a higher deck, which would put us in a safer place. Fortunately, that was not required. We were able to zigzag across the Atlantic. It took, I think we left on the 2nd or 3rd of September, and I think we arrived on the 16th of, we left on the 9th of September, and we arrived on the 16th of September. So it was about a week, the journey. The reason it took so long was because we were zigzagging the entire time that we were sailing, because we had to try to outmaneuver these U-boats that were chasing us. But we did arrive safely.
Did your parents later ever say how terrifying that must have been to know that you were basically being hunted by U-boats and you're out there in the middle of the ocean?
They certainly did. And they also told me that I was obviously oblivious to what was going on. They told me, as I recall, that there was a rocking horse, a wooden rocking horse on our deck. And they told me that I spent most of my time on the rocking horse, totally oblivious to what was going on. But they were obviously very, very frightened about that journey.
Can only imagine. Well, tell us about arriving in New York City.
Sure. On September the 16th, 1939, thank God, we arrived in New York Harbor. And you'll see in a moment the photograph of us being on the top deck of the ship. And there's the Statue of Liberty in the background. And everybody is just so happy to be in America. I vague recollection of people screaming, "America, America." And what's so interesting is that Statue of Liberty, which is significant to anyone and all Americans, has particular significance to me. And when I'm in New York from time to time, I'm in Lower Manhattan, I see the Statue of Liberty, I still become very, very emotional when I see that, because it means so much to me to have seen that. We're taken from the harbor directly over to Ellis Island, which at that time was an immigration center where we had to be processed. As I recall, that was an overnight event. And once we completed that process, we were allowed to enter the United States. Now, as I said earlier, we came with essentially nothing. But fortunately, my mother's older sister, my Aunt Hilda, she had left Vienna a few months before we did. And she and her husband and family had already settled in New York. So we were able to stay with them for that short period of time until my father could find work.
Mhm.
Initially, what my
Hen-
father did, I'm
Henry,
sorry.
can I jump in for just a minute? I wanted a question came in from a viewer named Jonathan who would like to know how old you were when at this time when you first came to the United States.
I came essentially on my fourth birthday. My
Oh.
fourth birthday would have been September 22nd, 1935. I came in to New York on September the 16th, 1 week before my fourth birthday.
So here you are, just 4 years old. Your family settled in New York, and your parents, your father lands a job, and they're able to start to get themselves established. Tell us about that.
My green card, that's correct. And you'll notice that my name is not Henry, it's Heinz. And anecdotally, I'll tell you that my mother tells me that she went to the supermarket when she arrived here, and she saw Heinz products like ketchup, mustard, baked beans, and she told me that that would not be a fitting name for her son, so they started to call me Henry, and that name has stuck with me all these years. I think the real reason probably was that the Heinz is too Germanic, and they didn't want to have that name for their son. So, but it was an interesting story in any event.
That was definitely a plausible one, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
As-
So saying my father, once we arrived in New York and were living with aunt and uncle, heard that there was some work in Philadelphia in leather because my father had been in the leather industry in Europe. So he went to Philadelphia to work, and he spent the entire week, the weekdays, I should say, in Philadelphia, came back to New York on the weekends. And that went on for some period of time until he found that there was a real robust leather industry in Wilmington, Delaware. And that's where we went. We moved, he moved the family to Wilmington, Delaware, which is where I grew up.
And what was that? What were those early days like for you making adjustments? You were, as you said, 4 years old when you arrived. Next year you were in kindergarten. What was it like for you?
For me, it was fairly easy and pleasant. I started school right away. I didn't speak any English when I started. Obviously, I only spoke German, but I picked it up as a young child much quicker than my parents. And I went all through grammar school in Wilmington. At that particular time, my parents had to attend night school. They had to learn the English language. They had to learn something about American history that would qualify them to be able to take the exam for American citizenship, which they did. And they were just so delighted to be in America, so happy to be in America. I went all through grade school there. I went to junior high, high school, ultimately went to the University of Delaware and graduated from Delaware.
And Henry, I was going to ask you during when you arrived in September 1939, of course, the United States would not be in the war until after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Do you remember if during that time your family, your parents were in touch with family and friends still back in Austria?
Yes, my father had several siblings. One of his sisters was his sister Wilma, and I do recall my father, and I went along with him, would go to the post office with boxes of non-perishable goods that he would be sending to his sister Wilma. My father never received any response. We don't know whether Sister Wilma received the packages or didn't receive the packages, but that didn't deter him. He kept on sending those packages whenever he could. So that's what happened during those. And of course, later, my father received a telegram telling him that his entire family had been killed in the concentration camps. And there's another interesting story that I can tell you that many years later, when I was driving a car, my parents never drove a car. We had a car in the family, but I was the family driver. And I was driving them through a small community in New Jersey known as Vineland, New Jersey. Vineland, New Jersey happened to have a number of small farms. It was a farming community. And for some reason, some survivors of the Holocaust who were able to escape wound up in Vineland and were operating these farms. And I was driving through, my father saw a sign, fresh eggs for sale. So he asked me to stop the car, and I did. And he went into the farmhouse to purchase some eggs. And for some reason, it took him a long time. He didn't come out for quite a while. And when he came out, he was really very, very upset. He was crying. And this is a remarkable coincidence. The woman who was operating the farm told my father that she was his sister, one of his sister's cellmates in a concentration camp, and proceeded to tell him that a German guard or an officer or soldier, I don't know what his position was, in the camp, gave my father's sister a poison pill to take just before she was to be taken to the gas chamber. An act of, I suppose you could call it a charitable act, so that she wouldn't die of asphyxiation. She would have a more peaceful death.
And
That's how
this your father learned from a chance encounter while you're driving on the highway in Vineland.
It's an unbelievable coincidence, exactly. And lately, more recently, I received information from someone here at the Holocaust Museum, that his sister, the one that we sent the care packages to, Sister Wilma, she was killed in the camp called Treblinka. That's how I found out about that. My father never knew that.
Did you learn about other family members that have survived? I know you mentioned earlier getting the telegram telling you that many in the family have been murdered.
As I said, my aunt Hilda, my uncle Sam, and their family, they survived. They were in New York for a few months before we arrived. My mother's brother went to Australia, my uncle Ernie, with his family. And I have cousins there now, my cousin Ann and my cousin Tom Springer, who are living in Melbourne and Sydney, Australia. They were able to get into Australia.
And we have a viewer named Adele who writes and asks, "Hello, Mr. Weil. Could you tell me if your parents shared with you about how they coped during this terrible time? As parents, I'm sure they tried very hard to shield you in many ways."
Yes, they did. As I said earlier, they did shield me, and they shielded me almost 100% from the time I was very young, and didn't start to talk with me about it until much later in life in America. But even then, they didn't really dwell on it. They didn't talk that much about it. The two things that I do recall is the receipt of the telegram telling my father about his siblings, and other than that, what I really learned about the Holocaust is what I really learned about on my own, and reading about it and hearing about it, and now, of course, being a volunteer at the Holocaust Museum.
And Henry, we have another question for you coming in. A viewer named Eliza asks, "Have you been back to Austria? And if so, what was it like returning post-war and seeing how the country had changed?"
Sure. Twice. I went back to Vienna twice. The first time was in the mid-'70s. Not exactly sure whether it was 75 or something. It was sometime in the middle of the 70s. And my wife wanted to go. I didn't really have any desire to go. As a matter of fact, I objected, but she prevailed, and we did go back. And we went all through the city, and I had a photograph of the apartment house where I was born and where I grew up. And so I went to that particular location and banged on the door, and the woman came downstairs, and she asked me who I was. And when I told her who I was, she says, "Oh my God," she says, "you were that nice Jewish family that left in the middle of the night. I remember my mother and father talking about your family at dinner, at the dinner table, and often wondered whether you made it out safely." And she says, "I'm so happy to see you." And she was very kind. She showed me all around. And then she finally said, "Now look, would you like to go up and see your apartment?" And I said, "Yes, I would like that." And she said, "But the Gestapo officer, Herr Russo, and his wife, Frau Russo, are living in that apartment." Now, I just couldn't understand how that was possible. This is 30 years after the end of World War II. Number one, was he still alive? Why was he never persecuted or prosecuted, I should say, as a war criminal? But apparently they were still living there. And of course, you can imagine what my response was. No, I was not going to meet them. That was my first trip back. Mm-hmm. About 4 years ago, we went back again. Went back at the invitation of the American Jewish Committee. They invite survivors and offspring of survivors back to Austria. Very nice trip. we stayed in the section of Austria, of Vienna, called Leopoldstadt, which is where the Jews lived during and before the war, and which is now a play on Broadway, by the way. If you're ever in New York, you would like to go see the play Leopoldstadt. Anyway, we went back. We had a very, very nice visit. We were able to meet actually the president of Austria, whose name is Alexander van der Bellen. A really nice gentleman. He spoke very kindly. There were 13 of us there. And he spoke so kindly to us, made us, trying to make us feel better about the Austrians. And he was very, very, very kind. We enjoyed meeting him very, very much. I went back to that apartment house, and I couldn't find the lady, but I found the superintendent. I said to the superintendent, is Russo and Frau Russo still living in my apartment on the second floor? He said, no, they both passed away. So that was the end of that. But it was those were memorable trips.
Can only imagine. Henry, I just really have one more question for you today. As we face rising anti-Semitism, related conspiracy theories, and Holocaust denial, please tell us what we can and should learn from you, from what you experienced, you and your family, during the Holocaust.
I have really not had too much. I have not can't recall, but maybe 2 instances of anti-Semitism that were directed at me. And let me tell you briefly what they were. When I first graduated from law school, I applied for a job with an insurance company here in Washington, and I was having an interview with the claims manager. Had a very nice chat, and he says, I'd like to hire you, but I have to make a phone call. I said, sure. And I was sitting right across the table from him. He picks up the phone, calls the main headquarters of the company. He says, I'd like to hire this young man. I think he'd do a good job, but he's Jewish. Can I hire him? I was dumbfounded. I was sitting there. This is like in 1961 or 62. He says, good news. I was given permission to hire you. I said, well, thank you very much. And I worked there for a few years. The second incident that I personally encountered was when I was a trial lawyer and I was trying a case in suburban Maryland, and I had my client on the witness stand. She had been in an accident. She had back injury, and I put a question to her. Could you please explain the degree of pain that you encountered as a result of this accident? And her response was, it was like a Jew sticking a knife in your back and twisting it. This is in front of a jury, a judge on jury. My initial reaction was to just pick up my papers, my file, and leave the courtroom. But better judgment told me not to do that. I might be disciplined by the bar, may even get disbarred. I don't know. You can't just abandon a client. So what I did is I approached her after the case was completed. I said, ma'am, can you explain something to me? When someone sticks a knife in your back and twists it, tell me what the difference in the degree of pain is, whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew. Well, I guess she was dumbfounded at that point. She didn't respond, and I just walked away. But to answer the question, I mean, it's so terrible to see what's happening in this. I never dreamed that we would confront any anti-Semitism in the United States. And I feel very, very bad for my children and my grandchildren having to live in this atmosphere. It's just unbelievable. It's so sad. What I would say is, and I'm going to just add before I go on, is we have some of the survivors here who were in the concentration camps, who endured horrific times in those camps. For them to be here and have survived that, and now having to confront anti-Semitism at the present time in this country, is just unimaginable how they must feel.
Well, Henry, we are just so grateful to you for your willingness to be our first person to spend this time with us, share the experience that you went through, your parents went through, and of course, the rest of your extended family. So thank you for spending time as our first person today.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd like to also invite you to join us for our next First Person program. Please tune in on July 26, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer Ray Goldfarb. Ray was only 10 years old when the Nazis occupied her hometown in Poland. Tune in to learn how Ray and her mother survived by escaping 2 ghettos and joining a group of partisans until they were eventually liberated. Thank you for watching today.